At the dawn of the 20th century, America was restless. Factories roared. Cities swelled with newcomers. Railroads stitched the continent together from coast to coast. It was an age of invention and ambition. Skyscrapers climbed higher each year. Fortunes were made almost overnight, and yet beneath that progress, there was unease. Labor strikes paralyzed entire industries. Immigrants arrived by the millions, bringing languages, customs, and political ideas unfamiliar to many Americans. Newspapers warned of anarchists and revolutionaries. Rumors spread of bombs hidden in parcels, and plots whispered in crowded tenements. The old order felt as though it were slipping. In 1908, quietly and without public ceremony, the federal government created a small investigative unit within the Department of Justice. It was not yet called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was simply the Bureau of Investigation. There was no dramatic announcement, no national debate, just a practical decision made in Washington. The Attorney General at the time, Charles Bonaparte, a great-nephew of Napoleon, believed the Department of Justice needed its own trained investigators. Until then, federal prosecutors had borrowed agents from the Secret Service. Bonaparte believed that was inefficient and risky. He wanted loyalty. He wanted direct control. He wanted information gathered without delay. So a handful of agents were appointed. Their task was straightforward: investigate federal crimes and report back to the Department of Justice. But the nation they served was already changing in ways few could fully predict. By 1914, war had engulfed Europe. Though the United States remained neutral at first, the conflict cast a long shadow across the Atlantic. Americans read headlines about espionage and sabotage. Stories circulated of foreign agents operating on American soil. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, suspicion hardened into policy. Congress passed the Espionage Act. Soon after, the Sedition Act followed. Words, spoken or printed, could now be treated as threats if they were deemed disloyal. The young Bureau of Investigation suddenly found its mission expanding. Agents were instructed to monitor dissent, to identify potential spies, to track foreign nationals from countries at war with the United States. The definition of danger broadened quickly. The Bureau began compiling lists, names, addresses, affiliations. They tracked socialists, labor organizers, pacifists, anyone whose loyalty seemed uncertain in a time of war. Information became their currency, and they gathered it meticulously. When the war ended in 1918, relief swept across the country. But peace did not bring calm. Instead, it brought new fears. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution had transformed Russia. A monarchy had fallen. A radical new government had risen in its place. The idea that revolution could spread across borders unsettled many Americans. Then, in 1919, a series of anarchist bombings struck cities across the United States. Explosives targeted public officials, judges, and business leaders. One bomb detonated outside the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. The message was unmistakable. Palmer responded with urgency and with determination. The Bureau of Investigation became central to what would be known as the Palmer Raids. Across the country, Agents worked with local police to arrest thousands of suspected radicals. Meetings were infiltrated. Homes were searched. Immigrants were detained and, in many cases, deported. Speed often replaced caution. To many Americans, these actions felt necessary. The country appeared to be under siege from within. The fear was real. The violence had been real, but others began to question the scale of the response. How many of those arrested were truly plotting violence? How many were simply advocating unpopular political ideas? In the midst of this turmoil, a young lawyer within the Bureau was quietly making his mark. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. He was only 24 years old. Hoover did not command headlines. He worked behind desks, organizing information. He oversaw the Bureau's General Intelligence Division, developing an extensive card index system to catalog suspected radicals. Each card contained a name, a connection, a fragment of suspicion. Thousands upon thousands of cards filled drawers. Hoover understood something fundamental. Knowledge could be organized, and organized knowledge could be powerful. He believed disorder threatened the nation. He believed radical ideas, if left unchecked, could unravel society. And he believed that disciplined record-keeping was a defense against chaos. The Palmer raids eventually drew criticism. Newspapers questioned their legality. Courts dismissed cases for lack of evidence. Public opinion shifted as reports surfaced of detainees held without proper warrants. The Red Scare began to cool, but the Bureau had learned lasting lessons. It had learned how to conduct surveillance on a national scale. It had learned how to coordinate intelligence gathering across states. And it had learned that in moments of fear, the public would often accept extraordinary measures in the name of safety. By the early 1920s, the Bureau's reputation stood at a crossroads. It was seen by some as a necessary shield against extremism. By others, it appeared heavy-handed. Then came another blow to public confidence, this time involving corruption within the federal government itself. Teapot Dome scandal exposed bribery and misconduct at high levels of government. Though the Bureau was not the central culprit, the Department of Justice suffered reputational damage. Trust in federal institutions wavered. In 1924, seeking to restore credibility, the Attorney General appointed a new director to lead the Bureau of Investigation. He was young, only 29 years old. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover moved swiftly. He dismissed agents he considered unqualified. He insisted on higher standards of education and conduct. Agents would be professional, disciplined, and beyond reproach. Background checks became rigorous. Appearance and decorum mattered. Hoover believed the Bureau must not only function effectively, it must appear incorruptible. Under his direction, the Bureau began transforming from a modest investigative unit into a carefully structured national institution. But alongside this professionalization, Hoover continued expanding the Bureau's files, carefully, quietly. Names accumulated. Organizations were monitored. Political movements were tracked. The Bureau's origins had been modest, a small office created for administrative efficiency. Yet within 2 decades, it had evolved into something far more significant. It had become a central repository of information about American life. It existed in a space between protection and suspicion, between public safety and private liberty, and that space would continue to widen because Hoover was only at the beginning of his tenure. He would lead the Bureau for nearly half a century, through economic collapse, global war, and ideological conflict, through moments when fear once again gripped the nation. But even in these early years, amid wartime panic and political unrest, the foundation had been laid. A belief had taken root that to defend democracy, one must sometimes watch it closely, very closely. And once an institution learns how to watch, it rarely forgets. The story of the Bureau's birth is not merely about its creation. It is about the moment it discovered its purpose, and about the man who would shape that purpose for generations. When protection requires surveillance, who decides where the line is drawn? In 1924, when J. Edgar Hoover became director of the Bureau of Investigation, he was just 29 years old. Young for such responsibility, soft-spoken, controlled, intensely disciplined. Bureau he inherited was small and shaken by scandal. Public trust in federal institutions had been weakened by corruption cases in Washington. Hoover understood that if the Bureau were to survive and grow, it would need something more than authority. It would need an image. He began by rebuilding from within. Agents were required to meet strict standards. Many were lawyers or accountants. They wore dark suits, kept short hair, and carried themselves with restraint. Hoover insisted they be educated, professional, and loyal. Training became formalized. Procedures were standardized. Records were organized with meticulous care. He believed that order was strength. And slowly, the Bureau began to change. In 1935, its name changed as well. It became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. The new title carried weight. It suggested permanence, national reach, and the timing was significant. The 1930s were years of hardship. The Great Depression had left millions unemployed. Banks failed. Families lost farms and homes. In desperate times, crime rose sharply. Gangsters became household names. John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson. Newspapers followed their movements like serialized drama. Bank robberies, shootouts, getaways across state lines. Local law enforcement often struggled to keep up. Criminals exploited gaps between jurisdictions. The FBI stepped into that vacuum. Hoover seized the moment. He equipped agents with modern weapons. He improved forensic techniques. He invested in fingerprint databases and crime laboratories. The FBI laboratory, established in 1932, became one of the first of its kind. Science would now support investigations. Evidence would speak where witnesses could not. When agents tracked down John Dillinger in 1934 outside a Chicago theater, the event was reported across the country. The message was clear. The federal government could strike back. Hoover understood publicity. He allowed carefully managed stories to circulate. The image of the G-man, clean-cut, incorruptible, fearless, entered American culture. Hollywood embraced the narrative. Radio programs dramatized federal cases. The FBI was no longer obscure. It had become a symbol. But behind that symbol was a director who controlled information tightly. Hoover maintained direct oversight over investigations. reports flowed upward to his desk. He cultivated relationships with journalists. He rewarded favorable coverage and froze out critics. He believed the Bureau must never appear weak. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the world moved toward another global conflict. World War II transformed the Bureau once again. Now the focus shifted from gangsters to spies, German agents, Japanese operatives, sabotage plots. The FBI took on counterintelligence responsibilities inside the United States. It monitored communications, investigated suspicious activities, and tracked individuals believed to be connected to enemy governments. In wartime, fear once again widened the definition of threat. The Bureau assisted in identifying individuals considered security risks. In the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps. Though the policy was driven at the highest levels of government, the FBI played a role in gathering intelligence and enforcing security measures. It was another reminder that in moments of national crisis, the boundaries between protection and intrusion can blur. When the war ended in 1945, the United States emerged as a global superpower. But peace did not bring ease. Instead, a new rivalry began, the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States faced one another not on battlefields, but through ideology, espionage, and suspicion. Communism became the great internal fear. Hoover was prepared. For decades, he had warned about subversion. Now his warnings seemed validated. The FBI expanded its counterintelligence efforts dramatically. Agents investigated suspected communist sympathizers, government employees, professors, artists. Loyalty programs were established across federal agencies. Background checks became routine. Associations, even distant ones, could raise suspicion. The Bureau compiled files, thousands of them. Hoover believed deeply that communism was not simply a foreign ideology but a domestic threat that could infiltrate institutions from within, and he believed it was his duty to root it out. Public hearings during the early 1950s, particularly those associated with Senator Joseph McCarthy, amplified fears of hidden enemies. Though Hoover and McCarthy did not always agree on tactics, both capitalized on the atmosphere of suspicion. For many Americans, the threat felt real. The Soviet Union had developed nuclear weapons. Espionage cases confirmed that secrets had been passed to Moscow. The FBI achieved genuine counterintelligence successes during these years. It uncovered spy rings. It identified double agents. It strengthened internal security measures. Yet at the same time, its surveillance extended beyond foreign operatives, civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, political activists. Hoover's concern was not limited to communism alone. He worried about social unrest, mass movements, and charismatic leaders who could mobilize public opinion. He kept personal files on politicians, on journalists, on celebrities. The existence of these files was rarely discussed openly, but their presence was understood. Members of Congress were cautious in their criticism of the FBI. Presidents valued its intelligence, yet few attempted to curb Hoover's authority directly. He had become one of the most powerful unelected officials in American history. For nearly 5 decades, he remained director, serving under 8 presidents: Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon. Each administration relied on the Bureau's information, and Hoover remained calm, reserved, imposing in his consistency. He cultivated loyalty within the ranks. Agents often spoke of him with reverence. The Bureau's culture emphasized discipline, patriotism, and silence. Internal dissent was rare. Externally, the FBI maintained its reputation as the nation's premier law enforcement agency. Yet, beneath that polished surface, tensions were building. The 1960s brought dramatic social change. Civil rights marches filled southern streets. College campuses erupted in protest against the Vietnam War. Generational divides widened. For Hoover, these movements represented instability. He authorized expanded surveillance programs aimed at organizations he believed might disrupt public order. Wiretaps were conducted. Informants were placed inside activist groups. To Hoover, this was preventive security. To critics, it was overreach. The paradox deepened. Bureau that had once pursued gangsters with public approval was now quietly monitoring American citizens engaged in political expression. Hoover justified these actions as necessary defenses against subversion. But questions lingered. How much power should a single director hold? Who oversees the overseer? By the late 1960s, Hoover was aging. His influence remained strong, but the country around him was changing rapidly. Younger Americans questioned institutions their parents had trusted. The press grew more investigative. Skepticism replaced deference. Yet Hoover continued to operate with remarkable autonomy. When he died in May 1972, he had led the FBI for 48 years, nearly half a century. Few figures in American government have exercised such prolonged authority. He left behind a bureau transformed from a modest investigative office into a vast national intelligence and law enforcement organization. He also left behind a legacy that remains debated. To some, he was a guardian of stability in turbulent times, a man who professionalized federal law enforcement and defended the nation from genuine threats. To others, he accumulated too much power, too little oversight, and too many secrets. The files he built were legendary. The reach of the Bureau under his direction was unprecedented, and the systems he created would outlast him, because even as Hoover's era ended, the structures of surveillance and intelligence gathering remained in place, carefully organized, meticulously maintained, ready for whatever threat might come next. And in the years that followed his death, some of those carefully guarded secrets would begin to surface, revealing just how far the Bureau had been willing to go in the name of protection. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War had settled into daily American life. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in classrooms. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. The Soviet Union loomed not just as a distant rival, but as a constant presence in the national imagination. Inside the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover saw threats everywhere. He believed communism was not merely a foreign government across an ocean. He believed it was an idea, one that could take root quietly, inside American institutions, inside communities, even inside movements that appeared patriotic on the surface. In 1956, The FBI launched a program that would remain secret for years. It was called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Its original purpose was to disrupt and weaken the Communist Party. Edgar Hoover did not want simply to monitor suspected communists. He wanted to neutralize them. The tools were subtle. Informants were planted inside organizations. Personal relationships were exploited. Anonymous letters were sent to create suspicion and division. Employers were quietly notified of an employee's political affiliations. Tax audits appeared unexpectedly. The goal was not always prosecution. Often, it was disruption. Confusion, distrust, internal fracture, and at first, few outside the Bureau knew it existed. As the 1960s began, America entered a period of profound change. The civil rights movement gathered momentum. Sit-ins, marches, and boycotts challenged segregation and discrimination across the South. Television cameras brought images of protest into living rooms across the country. To millions. It was a moral awakening. To Hoover, it was complicated. He publicly stated that the FBI supported civil rights enforcement. The Bureau did investigate acts of violence committed by white supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan. In several cases, FBI investigations helped bring perpetrators to justice. But privately, Hoover grew deeply suspicious of certain civil rights leaders. He feared communist influence within the movement. He believed outside agitators might exploit racial tensions to destabilize the country. One name in particular drew his attention. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. King, had emerged as a powerful national voice for nonviolent resistance. His speeches stirred conscience and conviction. His leadership drew crowds numbering in the tens of thousands. Hoover viewed him differently. The FBI placed King under surveillance. Wiretaps were authorized. Hotel rooms were monitored. Informants were assigned to report on his activities. Officially, the justification centered on alleged connections between some of King's associates and individuals suspected of communist ties, but the surveillance went far beyond political affiliations. Agents collected personal information. Private conversations were recorded. The Bureau compiled detailed reports about King's life. In 1964, an anonymous letter was mailed to King. It contained excerpts from surveillance recordings and suggested he should end his public life before his private life was exposed. The letter was unsigned, but years later, it would be traced back to the FBI. The episode remains one of the most troubling moments in the Bureau's history. And King was not alone. COINTELPRO expanded its reach throughout the 1960s. The program targeted the Socialist Workers' Party. It targeted Puerto Rican nationalist groups. It targeted organizations opposing the Vietnam War. As social unrest grew, so did the scope of the program. One of the most heavily targeted organizations was the Black Panther Party, founded in 1966. The Black Panthers advocated for armed self-defense and community empowerment. Their members patrolled neighborhoods, monitored police conduct, and organized free breakfast programs for children. To Hoover, the Panthers represented what he called the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. The FBI infiltrated local chapters, Informants provided detailed internal reports. Anonymous letters were sent to create suspicion between leaders. Efforts were made to intensify rivalries between activist groups. In some cities, confrontations between police and Panthers turned deadly. The most controversial case occurred in Chicago in 1969, when Black Panther leader Fred Hampton was killed during a police raid. Later investigations revealed that an FBI informant had provided information about the apartment layout. Before the raid, the event deepened distrust between law enforcement and many African American communities. Yet, COINTELPRO was not limited to racial justice organizations. Anti-war groups were monitored as protests against the Vietnam War intensified. Student organizations were infiltrated. Demonstrations were photographed and cataloged. The Bureau argued that some protest movements risked violence, and indeed, in certain instances, clashes did occur, but the program often blurred the distinction between preventing crime and suppressing dissent. The techniques used under COINTELPRO were rarely subject to court approval. They operated in secrecy, authorized internally within the FBI. For years, the American public knew nothing about it. There were no press conferences. No congressional hearings, just memoranda typed, filed, and locked away. Inside the Bureau, these actions were framed as defensive measures. Hoover believed he was protecting the nation from subversion. He saw disorder spreading across campuses and city streets. He feared that unrest could spiral into chaos. But outside the Bureau, another perspective was forming. Activists began to suspect they were being watched. Some discovered informants in their ranks. Strange letters appeared. Meetings were disrupted by internal suspicion. Trust eroded. Still, the full scale of COINTELPRO remained hidden. Then, on the night of March 8, 1971, a small group of ordinary citizens took an extraordinary step. They broke into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. The group called itself the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. They were not professional criminals. They were teachers, activists, and concerned Americans. They entered quietly and removed files from filing cabinets. What they found inside would change the course of the Bureau's history. The documents revealed the existence of COINTELPRO. They described tactics of infiltration, psychological warfare, and efforts to disrupt lawful political activity. The burglars mailed copies to major newspapers. At first, editors hesitated. Publishing classified government documents carried legal risk. But eventually, stories began to appear. The secret program was no longer secret. Public reaction was intense. Many Americans felt betrayed. The idea that a federal law enforcement agency had targeted citizens for their political beliefs struck at the heart of democratic principles. Congress took notice. Investigations followed. But in 1971, when those documents first surfaced, the full reckoning was still ahead. For years, COINTELPRO had operated in the shadows, justified internally as necessary defense. Now, it stood in the light, and the country would soon confront a difficult question. In a democracy founded on free speech and peaceful assembly, how far can a government go to protect itself before it begins to undermine the very freedoms it claims to defend? Section 4, The Break-In, 1971, and the Reckoning. On the night of March 8, 1971, while much of the nation was focused on a heavyweight boxing match between Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali, a small group of citizens moved quietly through the streets of Media. Pennsylvania, they carried no weapons. They were not trained operatives. They were teachers, professors, a cab driver, a daycare worker, ordinary Americans. They called themselves the Citizens, commissioned to investigate the FBI. Their plan was simple: break into a small FBI field office, take documents, expose what they believed the public deserved to know. They chose the night of the fight deliberately. They hoped agents would be distracted. Inside the office, filing cabinets lined the walls, rows of drawers filled with reports, memoranda, and correspondence. The group worked quickly. They gathered documents into suitcases and cardboard boxes. They locked the door behind them. When they left, by morning, the files were gone. The burglars did not know exactly what they would find, but as they began reading through the material, one term appeared repeatedly: COINTELPRO. Counter intelligence program. The documents described efforts to disrupt political organizations. They detailed surveillance, infiltration, and campaigns to sow distrust among activists. Some memoranda contained explicit instructions to expose, disrupt, and neutralize groups considered subversive. Burglars made copies. They mailed packets anonymously to journalists and members of Congress. At first, many editors hesitated. Publishing internal FBI documents carried risks. The country was already tense. The Vietnam War continued overseas. Protests divided communities at home. But eventually, newspapers began printing excerpts. The Washington Post was among the first. As the stories appeared, Americans learned that the FBI had engaged in systematic efforts to monitor and interfere with domestic political organizations, often without warrants, often without public knowledge. Shock spread slowly. For decades, the FBI had been one of the most trusted institutions in the country. It had pursued gangsters. It had caught spies. It had cultivated an image of disciplined professionalism. Now, that image began to crack. Members of Congress demanded answers. Within the Bureau, leaders condemned the break-in as criminal. They emphasized that the documents had been stolen. They defended the agency's actions as necessary in the face of real threats. But the questions would not fade. 2 years later, in 1973, another scandal deepened the crisis of confidence in government. Watergate. The break-in at Democratic Party headquarters and the subsequent cover-up revealed abuses of executive power at the highest levels. President Richard Nixon would eventually resign. Public trust in federal authority fell sharply. In this climate, Congress established a special investigative body in 1975, formerly known as the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. It became widely known as the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The committee examined the activities of the FBI, the CIA, and other intelligence agencies. For the first time, detailed testimony about COINTELPRO and related programs entered the public record. The hearings revealed surveillance of civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and political organizations, They documented efforts to discredit individuals, to spread false information, to create internal conflicts. The picture that emerged was complex. The FBI had indeed confronted genuine threats during the Cold War. Espionage cases were real. Violent groups existed. National security concerns were not imaginary. But alongside those threats, the Bureau had also extended its reach into lawful political activity. The Church Committee concluded that intelligence agencies had operated with too little oversight and too much secrecy. Reforms followed. In 1976, Attorney General Edward Levi issued new guidelines restricting the FBI's domestic intelligence activities. Investigations would require clearer evidence of criminal intent. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened. In 1978, Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, known as FISA. Under FISA, certain types of surveillance required approval from a special federal court. The aim was to balance national security with constitutional protections. On paper, new guardrails were in place. The era of unchecked internal counterintelligence appeared to be ending. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. The FBI remained a powerful institution. Its responsibilities did not shrink. They evolved. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, the Bureau focused heavily on counterintelligence against the Soviet Union. Espionage investigations uncovered real betrayals within American institutions. The need for secrecy did not disappear. It simply changed form. And then, in 2001, a new crisis would reshape the Bureau once again. But before we turn to that moment, it is worth pausing in the early 1970s, because for the first time in its history, the FBI had been forced into public self-examination. The break-in in media, Pennsylvania, carried out by citizens who believed transparency was essential, had set that process in motion. The burglars themselves remained anonymous for decades. They did not seek fame. They did not hold press conferences. They believed the documents should speak for themselves, and those documents raised enduring questions. How much secrecy is compatible with democracy? When does protection become intrusion? Who ensures that an agency tasked with enforcing the law does not quietly bend it? These questions did not end with the Church Committee. They would return in new forms in the decades ahead, because the tension between liberty and security is not confined to one era. It is woven into the fabric of the Republic itself. More than a century has passed since the Bureau of Investigation was formed in 1908 from a small office in the Department of Justice. It grew into the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a global law enforcement and intelligence organization. It pursued gangsters during the Great Depression. It hunted spies during World War II and the Cold War. It investigated terrorism, organized crime, and cyber threats in the modern age. Its agents have risked their lives in service to the country. Its laboratory innovations changed forensic science. Its counterintelligence work uncovered genuine dangers. And yet, alongside those accomplishments, there is another history, a history of secret programs, of surveillance conducted in silence, of files kept in locked drawers. The story of the FBI is not a simple tale of heroism or wrongdoing. It is the story of an institution shaped by fear, ambition, crisis, and reform. In times of danger, Americans have often granted their government broader authority. After wars, after attacks, after moments when uncertainty overwhelms calm, each time the balance shifts. Then, slowly, the country reassesses, oversight strengthens, laws are revised, debates return. The cycle continues. Today, the tools of surveillance are no longer limited to wiretaps and paper files. Information moves through digital networks at extraordinary speed. Data can be stored, analyzed, and retrieved in ways unimaginable a century ago. The essential questions, however, remain remarkably familiar. How much power should a security agency hold? How transparent must it be? How does a democracy defend itself without diminishing the freedoms that define it? The FBI seal bears the words fidelity, bravery, integrity. Those words reflect ideals. History shows how difficult it can be to uphold them under pressure. The Bureau's legacy is neither entirely light nor entirely shadow. It is something more human. An institution created to guard the nation and shaped by the same fears, hopes, and imperfections that shaped the nation itself. And so the story does not truly end, because every generation must decide again where the line is drawn between vigilance and intrusion. Between secrecy and accountability, between safety and liberty. That decision is never permanent. It is an unfinished balance, one that continues to define the American experiment.